The problem isn't that we disagree. The problem is we've forgotten how to do it well. People tend to shut down to keep the peace or go on the attack, and then blame themselves or others for overreacting. And today, disagreement feels dangerous, and expressing a different view can lead to shutdown, rejection, or even violence. I'm Ryan Soave, and I've spent my career as a therapist and coach, helping individuals, families, and systems navigate challenging situations. This video shows you how to reframe disagreement as a tool for deeper connection and not a threat to avoid. So many of us treat disagreement like a landmine to be avoided at all costs. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need to do. Disagreement is only not dangerous, it's a necessity. All invention and innovation requires disagreement. In inventing the light bulb, Edison had to disagree with the idea that light could only come from a flame. The Wright brothers in inventing flight had to disagree with many thought the laws of physics were at the time. And as a therapist, when I work with people, I'm actually asking them, and they're asking themselves by coming to me, to help them disagree with their histories, to disagree with the scripts they've been running so that they can become an author of their life. However, disagreement can trigger our nervous system, that when we see that someone has a different view than we do, and while disagreement itself is not dangerous, it sure can feel that way. And we go into survival mode. The fear of rejection or having to see things a different way can outweigh the desire for honesty. Most of us never learned how to stay grounded in the middle of conflict. We can see it as something that will take from us, when in fact, the ability to be in conflict, to stay present, to lean into disagreement can actually open up our lives to entirely new possibilities. Disagreement and conflict can then lead to violence, and it doesn't have to. In yogic philosophy, there's a principle called Ahimsa, and Ahimsa is nonviolence. And in order to understand what nonviolence is, we must understand violence in this context. And as we look at it, the most dense and gross forms of violence is that I hit you or kill you. And more subtle than that is how I speak to you. And more subtle than that is how I think about you. And more subtle than that is how I think about and speak to myself. And in this, the subtle informs the gross. How I think about myself informs how I think about you, how I speak to you, and how I then interact with you. And when we can really understand how we think about ourselves and the worldview that we hold, there's possibility that opens up in which there's room for the views of others. And it doesn't have to move toward violence. In fact, we can communicate in a nonviolent way. And that does not mean avoiding conflict. It means leaning into it, staying grounded and present, and being open and curious. Martin Luther King Jr. said that true peace is not the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And what we understand he meant by justice in this is fairness and dignity for all, not for the individual, not for one small group, but for the greatest good. And in that journey toward fairness and dignity, he says it can require tension, that we can be uncomfortable, that we have different viewpoints. Maybe we have different faith, different culture, but that we can really see the others as human and understand what their desires are, not only for themselves, but for their families and their communities. This search for dignity and fairness on the way to peace, in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about it, almost requires tension. Again, not that we avoid conflict, but that we lean into it in a nonviolent way that treats others with respect and kindness. This doesn't mean we have to agree. It doesn't mean that we have to get on this exact same page with them, but that we can learn to understand others and allow them to understand us. One of my favorite sayings that I did not come up with, and I'm not really quite sure who did, is that peace is not finding calmer seas, it's building a better boat. And with that better boat that we build around ourselves, the ability to lean into discomfort, the ability to experience tension, allows us to move toward that true peace that he spoke about, not only for ourselves, but for all of those around us. When conflict flares and people are triggered, it feels personal. I'll use an example from my own life. My marriage. My wife is the most important person on the planet to me. Our relationship is so important. It's what allows us to create fertile ground for our children to grow and to be good humans. Even though she's the person I chose to be my wife, and I'm the man she chose to be her husband, I can promise you we don't agree on everything. We are probably close to 100% on the same page as to what we want for our children. But we're lucky on any given day if we're 50, 60, 70% in agreement on how to get there. We each have our own histories that we bring to our relationship. When we do get into disagreement and an argument in a way that's not moving us forward, it's rarely me arguing with her or her arguing with me. It's my past arguing with her past. Our whole set of all of our experience in life that programmed us to see life a certain way can get in the way of our relationship. However, when we can disagree, when we allow ourselves to see the other's viewpoint and have respect for it, not only do we find peace in our relationship, but we find new ways to parent, to be better as we raise our children. I often used to say when one of our teenagers was acting in a way that felt challenging, when I was under stress and she was under stress, she would see him as a baby who needed to be coddled, and I would see him as a 45-year-old man who needed a job. And neither one of those would be the best way to relate to him. But that's what our history informed for us in an automatic and unconscious way. And in doing work around that doesn't mean it's going to go away, but when we can recognize that those are the character liabilities that we bring to the situation, we can understand when we're in reaction and together move more toward response. And again, that's the way we invent and innovate, not only better ways to be parents, but better ways to be individual human beings and better ways to be in relationship with each other. And that requires us leaning into disagreement that doesn't feel great all the time. I'm not a media figure or an influencer or a political analyst. I'm a therapist. I work in the realm of behavior and psychology, and much of what I do is helping my clients disagree with their own history in a way that allows them to invent and innovate in their own lives. But I want to talk about an example from my field that really speaks to the power of labels. When we label others, not only do we put them in a box, but we put ourselves in a box, and we start to lose agency. There was an experiment done in the 70s by a Dr. Rosenhan, and he and several people came up with a plan to have people who did not exhibit signs of serious mental illness or mental illness at all, and had them check into psychiatric facilities. And their instruction when they checked in was to simply say that they were hearing voices. And in those voices, they were hearing one word. And when asked what that word is, they were either to say empty, hollow, or thud, and that's it. And in every case, in 12 different facilities, these people were admitted for serious mental illness. Many of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia and put on significant psychiatric meds. The shortest stay was 7 days, and the longest stay was 52 days. And when they were prescribed meds, each of these people pocketed them and then threw them away. They did not take them. So they were not medicated. But what they found was that during their stay, when they were compliant, they were diagnosed as people-pleasing. When they took notes, they were diagnosed with excessive writing. And something very interesting in this is that there were several documented incidences where the other patients in the facility came to these pseudo patients and asked them if they were a reporter or somebody who was checking up on the facility. While the medical providers all saw these people as seriously mentally ill, the other patients saw them for who they really were. After the experiment was over, they went back and told these facilities what they'd done and said they were going to do it again. So the facilities went on guard. Now, what Rosenhan and his group decided to do was not send any more pseudo patients in, but they still monitored the facilities. And over the next few months, they found dozens of people who they now went the other way and said that they were not mentally ill. When I think about this experiment, I see that the lens that the medical providers were seeing the people through was that of mental health diagnosis. Just simply by the fact of them checking in and saying a few words, they labeled them and put them in a box. I really seriously doubt that these people were trying to do harm at all, but that's the lens through which they saw their patients. I think this is what we see happening in the world right now. We label someone as part of one party. We label someone as voting for one person. We label someone having a certain religion or from a certain culture, and then we put them in a box. And what we're doing then is putting ourselves in a box. This gets amplified on social media and in traditional media, and they're not really seeing us as human beings. They're seeing us as a group with a label. Yet what I believe is that we as neighbors or in communities can be like the patients in the facility and see each person for who they really are. A person trying to make it through life, probably with a very similar view on what they want for their families and their communities, but maybe going about it in a different way. So what do we do with this? I think it starts with the individual. Just like in violence where the subtle informs the gross, I believe the same way happens in our communities. If we can each take a look at our own sides of the street, what we're bringing to the table, that does not mean that we have to totally get on board with what others are doing. But when we can understand our own biases and our own judgments, it allows us to open up a space where we can see others in a different light. In the St. Francis prayer, there's a line that says, "It is better to understand than to be understood." And I believe if we all took that tact, the world could become a very different place. And I'm not suggesting that each of us need to go out and change the world. What if we just change our own world? What if we bring that dynamic to our families, to our workplaces, to our communities, one person at a time? I challenge you to ask yourself how different it would be if you really approached a situation trying to understand rather than being understood. And that can start with understanding yourself, taking pause before going into a conversation where you know there might be disagreement, checking in with yourself. What am I bringing to the table? Not just simply looking at what they're bringing to the table and what I need to defend, but rather, what can I be curious about? And this is how we can begin to transform conflict from something to survive into something that can heal. The goal isn't to be right, it's to be connected to yourself, to others, to what's really good. A friend of mine always used to say that the biggest price of transformation is being wrong about the things we've been being right about. What is it that I'm being right about? What is it that I'm seeing in a fixed way? And when I see it in a fixed way, it doesn't allow for possibility. It doesn't allow for openness and opportunity. Just like internal tension calls for regulation, external tension does too. That we don't immediately go for the fight. Ask yourself, what are you defending in this moment? This doesn't mean that you can't see a situation that if it continues, it can lead to something that's not safe for us. But if you're there in the moment having a conversation, the threat isn't immediate. And when the threat isn't immediate, then we can take pause. We can stay connected. And that's where we can start to be curious. That's where we can start to understand rather than be understood. So I ask you, I invite you, I plead with you to practice disagreement, to have a conversation with someone who sees something different from you. And rather than going in trying to convince them that your way is the right way, just listen. Ask questions. You can always have the ability to go back and argue and fight for what you think is right. But for this practice, just listen. Ask questions. Be curious. Learn. And rather than asking questions just about whatever it is you're disagreeing about, ask them questions about who they are. What's important to them? What are their values? What do they want for themselves and their families? What do they want for their communities? Be curious about that. I really truly believe that most people are very similar in what they want. Just like what I talked about with my wife and our children. Wanting the right thing, wanting what's good for everybody, but not being on the same page with how to get there. In order to start getting to solutions, it's so important that we understand who the other person is. Really. Not just as a label, not just as a party, not just as a culture or religion, but as an individual, as a human. Please go out and practice this. If it's really challenging for you, don't start with the hardest topic in the world. Find somebody that roots for a different football team than you do and have an open conversation. That might sound silly, but start with that. Please go out and practice this. Now that we've explored what disagreement really means, the question becomes, how will you show up the next time conflict arises? Will you shut down or will you stay curious? Will you react from the story or will you pause and reconnect? Will you choose peace as presence and not performance? This is your moment to turn theory into practice. Stay in the room, stay with yourself, stay with the tension. That's where the healing begins. I'll see you in the next one.